All across the world, tropical cities are thriving. Singapore has nearly 6 million people. Miami continues to grow. Even mid-sized Southeast Asian cities now hold several million residents. Yet if you glance at a globe, Northern Australia looks like it should have one as well. It doesn't. Why? In 2025, Australia's population sits at about 27 million, but the north remains thinly populated. We'll compare soil, climate, economics, and strategy, and show why proximity to Asia hasn't been enough. To understand this puzzle, we need to look closely at why the north appears so empty compared to the same latitude elsewhere. The puzzle of the empty north. Australia's northern half forms one of the most striking anomalies in global settlement. Stretching thousands of kilometers along warm seas and sitting at the same latitude as some of the world's busiest population centers, it remains sparsely inhabited. Just across the Arafura Sea, individual Southeast Asian cities host more people than the entire northern half of Australia combined. The contrast is made sharper when you look at the numbers. Jakarta's vast metropolitan zone surpasses 30 million inhabitants, and the dense city-state of Singapore supports nearly 6 million within an area smaller than many Australian suburbs. In the north of Australia, by comparison, urban life clusters in small to mid-sized cities at best, with Darwin, Cairns, and Townsville standing as the largest, and none approaching global standards of a metropolis. Australia's total population in 2025 is about 27 million. Yet of that figure, only around 2% live in the north, a figure that reflects the entire region above the Tropic of Capricorn. Darwin, the Northern Territory capital, is home to roughly 138,600 people by 2024 estimates. Cairns, on Queensland's tropical coast, has about 163,200. Further down the coast, Townsville counts around 189,300. These are not insignificant communities, but when viewed against the backdrop of a country this large, they barely register as population anchors. Together they add up to fewer than 500,000 people, a number Melbourne alone adds in growth within a single decade. The trajectories of these places have also been far more modest than their southern counterparts. Northern cities have indeed grown over the past decade, but only by single-digit percentages spread across 5 years. Incremental increases that keep them sized as regional centers rather than national hubs. Meanwhile, the story looks different in the south. Australia's largest capitals have drawn hundreds of thousands of new residents in the same time span. Brisbane and Perth, for example, have each added several hundred thousand to their broader metropolitan populations in recent years, exerting a gravitational pull far stronger than anything seen in the tropical north. The result is a lopsided population map that continues to tilt heavily toward the temperate southeast. This imbalance raises questions that run deeper than demographics. It's not that people cannot live in the tropics. The nearby examples of Singapore, Ho Chi Minh City, and Manila prove the opposite. These cities sit within similar climates, yet absorb millions upon millions of new residents each decade. The northern Australian coast, by contrast, appears quiet and dark when viewed from space at night, while Southeast Asia glows as a dense urban network. The difference cannot simply be explained by accident of history or missed opportunities. It reflects a set of physical and economic boundaries imposed by the land itself. Settlement patterns across the continent have reinforced this gap. From the beginning of colonization, the largest centers clustered where water, farmland, and trade offered reliability. Southeastern Australia supplied fertile valleys, natural harbours, and a link to Britain's shipping lanes. Once these advantages took root, institutions and industries followed, anchoring growth for the long term. The north lacked comparable conditions. Soil fertility was thin, river systems unpredictable, and early attempts to establish farming settlements faltered. Mining camps or cattle stations drew temporary booms, but when resources thinned or economic tides shifted, the populations ebbed. None grew into self-sustaining cities to rival Sydney, Melbourne, or Adelaide. These structural limitations remain visible today. Darwin connects more directly by air to parts of Southeast Asia than to the rest of Australia, but such positioning has not turned it into a vast transport hub. Cairns draws millions of visitors yearly for the Great Barrier Reef, yet tourism alone does not provide the stability to lift the city's population into metropolitan scale. Townsville, despite offering a university, port facilities, and military bases, has not broken beyond its role as a medium-sized regional city. Each of these places has important functions, but their growth is capped by both environmental constraints and the centripetal pull of southern capitals. It often surprises outsiders, because on a world map, the north looks ideally placed for trade and expansion. The seas to its north are crowded with shipping lanes. Asia accounts for much of Australia's commerce. Strategic logic suggests there ought to be a major city here, funneling goods and migrants across these waters. Yet in reality, the major flows of population and capital gravitate towards Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. Southward cities with deeper reservoirs of infrastructure, easier climates, and stronger local economies. Geography might appear to point north, but the developmental momentum of the nation still points south. Comparing directly with neighbors only emphasizes the difference. Jakarta has multiplied in size several times over since mid-century. Manila expanded into a megacity of more than 14 million. Even secondary Southeast Asian centers like Makassar in Indonesia now surpass Australian northern hubs several times over. The reason is not that climates are inherently friendlier there, but that river systems, agricultural productivity, and abundant labor supplies supported densities Australia's north never matched. Environmental capacity, more than raw proximity to trade, determined where millions of people could realistically settle. The conclusion is that what looks like an overlooked opportunity on the map is, in fact, a consistent reflection of constraints that have shaped the region for generations. Northern Australia remains dependent on specific industries, tourism, mining, defence, rather than the broad economic foundations that drive continuous migration into city life. Urban concentration endures where climate, soil, and economic opportunity overlap productively. Absent that overlap, towns remain capped in scale no matter how much infrastructure is laid down to connect them. And so in 2025, despite 2 centuries of state building, national investment, and the lure of Asia nearby, only a sliver of Australians, around 2%, make their homes in the north. The dominant trend continues to hold. Settlement concentrates in temperate coastal belts far from the tropics. To many, this may feel counterintuitive, but it underlines the fact that map location alone never dictates urban growth. The more compelling question is why. If climate alone does not prevent large-scale settlement, and proximity to Asia has not spurred one into existence, then what has been powerful enough to hold potential megacities at bay for generations? So if it's not population pressure or climate alone, what exactly stopped a northern metropolis from forming? Geography's unforgiving advantage. On maps, the northern rim of Australia appears poised for success. An enormous coastline facing Asia, harbours with deep water, and broad expanses of land that could host a city as large as Sydney or Melbourne. But what seems promising in theory has never translated into a metropolis. Geography works against permanence here. The very features that appear advantageous, closeness to trade routes, open land, tropical seas, impose constraints that continually undercut the foundations of large-scale settlement. The north lies squarely within the tropics. Unlike the south, where seasons alternate predictably between warm summers and cooler winters, the calendar here oscillates between months of intense monsoonal rain and long stretches of dry heat. This swing between extremes dictates daily life. During the wet season, storms drop vast volumes of rain that overflow rivers, saturate floodplains, and close major roads for weeks at a time. But during the dry, water becomes scarce, landscapes brown quickly, and seasonal wetlands collapse back into arid grassland. The rhythm is relentless, and shaping a city around it is costly and complicated. One more factor has become clear in recent decades. Australia as a whole has warmed by about 1.5 degrees Celsius since 1910, but in the north that means increasingly intense rainfall events and greater cyclone strength projected into coming decades. The climate is tightening its grip rather than loosening it. Infrastructure here must be built with constant threat in mind. Roads buckle under monsoonal floods, bridges demand frequent reinforcement, and electricity lines face repeated storm damage. Cyclones cut swaths across the coast with ferocious winds, damaging ports, storage yards, and housing. Insurance premiums soar in these exposed areas. If the weather eats roads and homes, how could a city ever be stable here? Even with significant investment, projects become defined by defense and repair rather than daily civilian growth. A clear case is Darwin's new ship lift, a facility designed to service naval and commercial vessels. It reflects how strategically important the North is to Australia's future, but also how costly it is to anchor heavy infrastructure here. The Northern Territory government is backing it with $215 million, alongside up to $300 million, in concessional loan support from the federal government's NAIF. This scale of funding exists not to catalyze a sprawling new metropolis, but to make maritime operations survivable in a place where geography does not cooperate. The natural setting compounds these pressures. Large sections of coastal North Australia are flat, low-lying floodplains or mangrove zones reaching far inland. Building in them means either draining wetlands or raising ground surfaces, both expensive undertakings. The safer patches of elevated land are widely dispersed rather than forming a continuous base for expansion. Southern cities gained a foothold because they rose above river flood zones and expanded on consistent surfaces. The North offers little of that continuity. Everyday life in this environment also places a drag on growth. During the wet, extreme humidity and high heat lower outdoor productivity and raise health risks. Air conditioning is not optional but essential, pushing up living costs further. Large tropical cities elsewhere in the world overcame such disadvantages because millions of workers arrived to drive port trade or factory output, allowing economies of scale to offset the burden. No tropical population boom ever came to Australia's north. Without mass labour demand, the expense of adapting to harsh climate conditions has continued falling on a relatively small population base. This contrast explains why settlement momentum favours the south. River systems around Sydney, Brisbane, or Adelaide did not disappear with seasonal shifts. While those areas face their own risks, droughts, fires, they rarely see entire transport links vanish overnight. That steadiness matters as much as proximity. International shipping lanes may pass within sight of Darwin, but consistent infrastructure has proven more decisive than location in attracting lasting commerce. Developing the North requires confronting costs that never truly end. Reinforced building codes are mandatory across cities like Darwin, Cairns, and Townsville. Developers factor in cyclone wind loading and storm surge mitigation, which raise housing costs above southern benchmarks. Businesses question whether to establish headquarters in a zone where every warehouse or office demands both higher upfront expense and higher insurance premiums. Decision after decision pulls people and capital southwards. Resource industries show this clearly. Mining operations, gas projects, and large cattle stations all function well in the tropics, but in a way that avoids building permanent communities. Fly-in fly-out rosters work far more efficiently than constructing large residential cores. Workers arrive by plane, live temporarily in camps, and rotate out. The system allows billion-dollar projects to succeed in harsh geography, but also means there is no steady workforce staying behind to build suburbs, schools, or hospitals. Tourism hints at the same dynamic. Cairns thrives off proximity to the Great Barrier Reef and surrounding rainforest, yet its peak tourist season follows the cooler, drier months. During cyclone months, visitor numbers plunge. Hotels, resorts, and tours all adjust to that flow. Enough capacity for surges in winter, but not stable enough to justify scaling into a metropolitan economy year-round. The result is a city that can sustain vibrancy at mid-size, but not leap into the ranks of major global urban centers. At every turn, the equation remains the same. Geography gives the North unparalleled access to Asia, but it binds that advantage to immense burdens. Frequent storm damage, fragile ground, demanding weather, higher baseline costs. The balance always tilts toward caution. Where southern Australia could build on landscapes that hosted steady farming, permanent rivers, and reliable links, the North never found an equivalent footing. So although harbours lie open and land stretches wide, growth remains capped. Strategic infrastructure rises to meet national defence and resource needs, but not to seed a full-scale metropolis. Geography presses down on every calculation, residential, commercial, and governmental, making Northern Australia a region of towns and regional centres rather than global-scale cities. And geography alone is only part of the picture. Even if storms eased and terrain allowed steady construction, the next question cuts deeper. What, beneath the ground itself, can sustain human settlement, soils, and survival? Land in the north of Australia might appear endless, but the real limitation has never been space. It has always been about what that land can actually provide. For vast areas, the soil beneath the surface has been eroded of nutrients over millions of years. Heavy tropical rains, arriving season after season, leach minerals down through the profile and wash away organic matter before it can build up. What remains are sandy or lateritic soils that look green for part of the year, yet lack the fertility to sustain intensive farming. The very climate that creates bursts of lush vegetation also strips the ground of what agriculture needs. In the south and southeast, early settlers found a very different situation. Temperate weather systems, river valleys, and patches of alluvial soil gave them something to work with. Wheat, dairy, fruit, and vegetables could be grown with a reasonable chance of stable yields. Irrigation networks along the Murray and Darling supported farming even during drier years, giving those colonies a foundation of food security that could scale. Surplus crops allowed towns to grow and, over time, expand into major urban centers. That link between fields and cities has always been central. Food stability underpins settlement stability. Northern Australia, by contrast, never developed that cycle of abundance. Broadacre farming failed repeatedly because production was too thin to support large populations. Instead, agriculture turned toward extensive grazing. Cattle stations covered huge tracts of land where animals could roam to compensate for sparse vegetation. It produced income and supported a pastoral economy, but it did not create dense concentrations of food to feed cities. Communities could cluster around these enterprises, yet the land could not drive the growth of a metropolis. That reality still holds in 2025. Modern agricultural science may have improved techniques, but the problem of thin soils remains. Rainfall patterns add to the difficulty. Monsoon downpours can erode topsoil in days, undoing years of land management. Farmers who attempt cropping face waterlogging in the wet, followed by moisture stress when the dry season drags on. Yields swing widely from one year to the next, keeping agribusiness investment limited. Pockets of productivity do exist. Sugarcane fields thrive in parts of northern Queensland, and tropical fruit industries cluster around better soils near rivers. But these are narrow strips rather than expansive plains. They are enough to sustain towns like Cairns and Townsville, but not the millions of people needed for a truly large city. The Australian government has put resources into changing this equation. A notable case was the Ord River scheme in Western Australia's Kimberley. one of the most ambitious irrigation projects in the tropics. Dams, canals, and reservoirs were built to capture wet season floods and spread them across farmland. Early efforts focused on crops like cotton, but insect problems and high water demands shifted production to others such as chia, maize, and horticultural exports. In more recent years, the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility has supported similar projects in agriculture and water management. These initiatives show that engineering can lift productivity and generate export crops. But they also highlight the limits. Improved harvests have not translated into metropolitan population growth. Service towns around these projects remain small, underlining that productivity gains alone do not create critical mass for urban development. Modern technology has pushed further into the problem. Fertilizer use, soil conditioning, and precision irrigation are now standard across the few viable cropping districts. Satellite monitoring, automated pumps, and data-driven applications allow farmers to adjust water and nutrient delivery with great precision. On paper, this overcomes the natural disadvantages. In practice, the costs are steep. Fertilizer inputs must be constant, pumps consume energy on a large scale, and storm damage keeps maintenance high. NAIF-backed infrastructure can help, but the economics remain weighted toward high costs and low population return. Competing with the naturally fertile valleys of Victoria or the wheat belts of the West is essentially impossible. An audio-friendly way to think about it is simple. Low fertility, flood and drought swings, and high maintenance requirements add up to land that is expensive to turn into the mass farming base that big cities need. That balance has never tipped in Northern Australia's favour. The human consequences of this agricultural setting are clear. In regions with fertile soil, farming families pass holdings from generation to generation, anchoring steady communities. Towns accumulate services, schools, hospitals, markets, that make them resilient. In the north, fragile returns prevent this permanence. Farms change hands frequently, industries rise and collapse with commodity shifts, and whole families leave when thin margins no longer justify staying. Without steady long-term communities, urban growth never compounds into the density seen in the south. New technologies in 2025 have not altered this pattern as much as some hoped. Modern irrigated cropping employs fewer people per hectare than traditional farming, because machines and automation do most of the work. Profit can be made, and exports can be sold, without drawing in masses of laborers or their families. That dynamic benefits agribusiness but undermines city building. Darwin adds export income through mangoes and aquaculture, and northern sugarcane continues to supply refineries. But these industries distribute wealth across relatively small populations. They do not create urban systems large enough to sustain a metropolis. Food security remains the key point. Sydney and Melbourne flourished because their surrounding regions could feed hundreds of thousands before logistics and trade networks matured. Those hinterlands lowered living costs and made large-scale settlement affordable. In the north, by contrast, residents rely on food imported from across the continent or overseas. Supermarket shelves are stocked, but the supply chain stretches thousands of kilometers. That dependency makes daily life more expensive and large-scale urban growth more fragile. A northern city would face built-in disadvantages compared to one backed by its own farms. The conclusion is straightforward. Land may seem abundant, but fertility is not. Engineering projects can boost production, and technology can close gaps, but each hectare requires continual investment. Governments have tried irrigation schemes, corporations have tested high-value crops, and technology has raised yields in small areas. Yet none of it has generated the food base that sustains a dense population. In the north, productivity supports industries but not permanent, self-sufficient city life. This reality shaped more than just economics. It guided history. When settlers first arrived, they were looking for fertile ground and stability. What they encountered instead were soils that resisted cultivation and seasons that undermined permanence. The question is not only why today's cities cluster in the south, but why the early attempts in the north failed to grow into anything lasting. A history of failed settlements. The early colonial administrators never ignored the north. Its long coastline facing Asia seemed too important to leave empty, and London believed a settlement there would secure influence deep into the tropics. Planners imagined ports that could guard shipping lanes, extend trade links, and project Britain into seas where competitors were already active. But almost as soon as the first attempts began, the clash between ambition and local conditions became obvious. Fort Dundas was the first serious outpost, established in the 1820s on Melville Island. The idea was strategic: a northern base to monitor the Timor Sea and build commerce with the Spice Islands. Within a few years it failed. Crops withered in poor soil, disease spread easily in the tropical climate, and every needed supply still had to sail thousands of kilometers from Sydney. Lacking food and stability, the colony was abandoned. The British tried again in 1827 with a station at Raffles Bay on the Coburg Peninsula. It faced the same problems: malaria and dysentery, weak farming prospects, dependency on distant resupply, and an exhausting climate that wore down morale. After only a few years, it too was abandoned. A final attempt followed at Port Essington in 1838, also on the Coburg Peninsula. This outpost lasted more than a decade but never established self-sufficiency. Disease remained a constant problem, agriculture never thrived, and shipping lanes bypassed the harbour rather than stopping in. The effort ended in 1849, closing 2 decades of repeated collapse. Those early failures shaped colonial policy and helped cement the South as the settlement focus, a historical inertia the nation inherited. While Sydney, Hobart, and Melbourne flourished on fertile soils and temperate climates, each northern station faltered against scarcity, isolation, and sickness. The South could feed itself quickly from local farms, while the North remained dependent on supplies that took months to arrive. Distance amplified the vulnerability. Ships from Sydney carried the lifeline northward, but storms or breakdowns meant delays that were crippling for small communities. Without food production on the ground, every gap in supply became existential. What succeeded in the South was impossible to replicate in the North. Southern towns could gain a foothold because wheat, vegetables, and livestock grew well enough to break reliance on imports. Northern settlements never reached that turning point. The quest to plug into regional trade also fell short. Singapore and Batavia thrived because ships had reason to stop. They offered goods, services, and position on established routes. Port Essington could only hope ships would divert, but none did. With no natural demand, the harbour stayed empty, leaving the outpost isolated and expensive to maintain. Disease compounded every hardship. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical illnesses spread rapidly in these humid environments. With no effective medicine, mortality rates climbed and settlers abandoned hope of permanence. Families left, leaving gaps in continuity that doomed the social foundations of a real town. These pressures meant no early settlement in the North could cross the threshold into long-term growth. By mid-century, the lesson was clear to officials. The technology and medicine of the time could not make northern colonization sustainable. Attention shifted to the fertile and temperate South, where resources and labor produced steady returns. As investments flowed into agriculture, infrastructure, and coastal trade there, the North remained an afterthought, populated more by exploratory expeditions and resource ventures than enduring communities. This sequence of failures established a pattern. Settlements could be placed on maps and supplied by distant capitals, but without fertile soils and reliable food, they would never develop into cities. Ambition alone could not bridge that gap. The south became entrenched as the heart of Australia's urban structure precisely because the north never offered the same natural base. It would be wrong, though, to treat those early collapses as permanent verdicts. Medicine, engineering, and transport have advanced massively since the 1800s. Modern irrigation projects, vaccines, and air travel have made the north far less punishing than it was to early settlers. But the structural barriers remain. Soils are still thin, the wet and dry seasons still dictate a difficult rhythm, and remoteness still raises costs for communities far from the nation's population core. Technology mitigates, but it has not erased the pattern. The absence of a historic foothold in the north meant later towns like Darwin grew from different impulses: defense posts, trade stations, and resource access rather than agricultural surpluses. Without early self-sufficient colonies as a foundation, there was never the same compounding growth seen in Sydney or Melbourne. Northern towns filled gaps in national strategy, but lacked the fertile hinterlands and steady migration needed to build into something larger. That historical record explains a lasting asymmetry. Southern capitals expanded from fertile valleys and became magnets for millions. Northern outposts collapsed or remained small. The consequence is visible on today's map: a dense coastal crescent in the south and only scattered points in the tropics. And yet, while early colonists failed to root permanent communities, the north never stayed empty. Industries arrived again and again, drawn not by its suitability for settlement, but by the resources contained in its land and waters. This shift, from settlement ambitions to resource exploitation, gave the region a new role in Australia's story, and one that continues to shape it today. The North today, resource frontier. If the North never became a centre of permanent settlement, it nevertheless became central to Australia's resource economy. The region today functions less as a home for large populations and more as a frontier of extraction, where industry chases minerals, energy, and pastoral land rather than building continuous communities. Mining, gas, cattle, and tourism all play major roles, but their structure undercuts the possibility of metropolitan growth. Mining has been the most visible driver. The northern rim sits atop some of the continent's oldest rock formations, rich in bauxite, manganese, gold, and other ores. Each new project follows a familiar cycle. Prospection and discovery bring a rush of investment, followed by the rapid construction of plants, ports, and camps. Thousands of workers are flown in for the construction stage and the first years of operation. For a time, the region feels like it might grow into something lasting. But as markets shift, or bodies deplete, or prices dip, the industrial camps shrink just as quickly. Workers leave, camps close, and the area returns to quiet. The economic pattern repeats: strong during booms, thin during busts. Populations oscillate rather than anchor. Liquefied natural gas reinforces this dynamic. Off the northern coastline, some of Australia's most important gas reserves feed into large infrastructure hubs at Darwin and in the Pilbara. The building of gas plants and pipelines demands thousands of skilled staff, flown in from across the country or overseas. During these phases, Darwin's airport fills with engineers and contractors, accommodation blocks expand, and service industries get a sudden boost. Once operations settle, the required workforce contracts dramatically. Hundreds remain, but not the thousands who came before. Most workers cycle through the fly-in fly-out arrangement, 2 or 3 weeks on site before returning to homes elsewhere. An academic study highlighted in the background research confirms that FIFO practices dominate resource employment in the north, and that those job surges do not translate into permanent settlement. Darwin illustrates the point. Despite major energy exports moving through its harbour, the city's size remains modest, because the majority of its workers sleep in southern suburbs. Cattle grazing is another emblematic activity. Pastoral leases stretch across vast tracts of the Northern Territory and Queensland, bigger than many European countries. Herds range widely with low stocking rates, since sparse grasses cannot support dense populations of cattle. Operations employ only tiny crews relative to the size of landholdings. Helicopters muster animals, and mechanization performs tasks once requiring large teams. Even on the largest stations, permanent staff rarely number more than a few dozen. Employment is steady for those involved, but the scale is incapable of generating towns, let alone cities. What arises looks more like self-contained islands of activity, shearing sheds, homesteads, and private airstrips, rather than settlements growing into urban centers. The financial dimensions are substantial. Billions flow from mining royalties, gas exports, and pastoral production. But those funds are often captured and managed in southern capitals. Headquarters of major resource firms remain in Brisbane, Perth, or Melbourne. Accounts are balanced there, profits declared there, and jobs in company offices kept there. At the local level, infrastructure investment does occur. Airstrips, rail connections, upgraded ports. But these facilities serve the industry directly. They are not the schools, hospitals, or cultural amenities that would have broadened settlement. They support freight, not families. NAIF's reported commitments give scale to the picture. By mid-2025, the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility had invested about $4.4 billion in 32 projects, with forecasts of tens of billions in broader economic benefit and around 19,500 jobs supported. Yet the most prominent of these ventures, such as the Mardi Salt and Potash project in Western Australia or the Nolans Rare Earth development in the Northern Territory, remain classic examples of capital-intensive resource processing. They attract large sums of money and specialist skill, but they do not pull enough households to form a major city. Tourism does provide a different optic, but the same instability is present. Cairns is the heart of reef tourism, handling millions of domestic and international visitors each year. Darwin serves as a gateway to Kakadu, Arnhem Land, and the wider top end. But the peaks are seasonal. Dry season months bring dense visitor flows, hotels booked solid, and steady work for tour operators. As soon as the wet season arrives, cancellations mount, visitor numbers fall, and employment is cut back. Local businesses adjust by hiring casual or seasonal staff, but this prevents the continuity a larger city requires. Population does not concentrate when whole industries contract for part of the year. Ports and logistics hubs reinforce the resource-driven framework. Northern wharves are designed for bulk carriers loading iron ore, salt, gas, or live cattle. Railways bring heavy materials to the shore, while air transport shuttles staff in and out with precision timetables. Compare this with southern ports, where exports intermix with container traffic that also moves consumer goods to dense city populations. In the north, the networks are one-dimensional. Their role is to push resources outward, not to tie inward communities together. The defining feature of all these sectors is the fly-in, fly-out model. Workers move on cycles, towns expand with temporary accommodation, then quickly deflate. Studies show it is the dominant pattern, reducing demand for permanent schools, housing, and hospitals. This presents a sharp contrast to metropolitan growth elsewhere, which rests on permanent families clustering for work, education, and opportunity. In the north, the population is counted in rotating shifts rather than rooted residents. Camps that house 4,000 people in one season can be dismantled in the next. Cities cannot build upon that rhythm. Condensing the economic logic shows why. Northern industries generate very high economic value and temporary spikes in employment. But because they are capital-intensive and automate much of the work, they do not sustain a large, continuous labor market. Without that steady base of diverse professions, teachers, shopkeepers, builders, services, urban concentration cannot emerge. Industry thrives, but population thins. For the permanent residents who live in Darwin, Townsville, and Cairns, this imbalance is clear. Their towns act as service centers for industries and visitors, with retail strips, small universities, and hospitals. But much of their economy leans on transient surges, gas construction, mining expansions, peak tourist months. Incomes are substantial during those phases, and transport links improve. But when rotations end or wet months return, the momentum fades. Community institutions lack the critical mass to become self-sustaining, keeping northern cities frozen at medium size. What emerges is a picture of an economy that is resilient in revenue but fragile in settlement. Extraction and tourism ensure the North remains critical to the national ledger, but they do not build the kind of permanent population base that defines Sydney, Melbourne, or Brisbane. Economic activity here is strong enough to warrant billion-dollar ports and energy plants, but not broad enough to spark a metropolis. As the North continues to host enormous projects, the question grows sharper. If the land can produce such wealth, why can it not anchor a large city? The answer lies in how governments and institutions choose to shape industry and infrastructure, and whether investment can truly shift from projects tailored to exports toward foundations for community life. That question has echoed across Australian politics for generations, and it remains unresolved today. Infrastructure dreams. Successive governments have viewed the North as a place where infrastructure might unlock growth. For decades, political speeches and policy documents have imagined highways, ports, and energy links transforming the region into something more like Australia's southern cities. This ambition crystallized with the creation of the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility, or NAIF, in 2016. Its mandate was clear: provide loans to accelerate projects in transport, energy, resources, and agriculture that markets alone were unlikely to finance. By mid-2025, NAIF had committed about $4.30 to $4.40 billion to 32 projects, with forecasts of public benefits in the tens of billions and nearly 19,500 jobs supported. On paper, these numbers demonstrate scale. In practice, the projects show how infrastructure in the North has been directed primarily toward industrial efficiency rather than metropolitan life. Road investment illustrates the point. Long distances and seasonal flooding force the government to pour billions into upgrades. The Outback Way, promoted as Australia's longest shortcut linking Western Australia through the Northern Territory into Queensland, has inched forward through staged sealing projects. Highways around Cairns and Townsville have been reinforced to withstand heavy freight, while bridges are rebuilt after cyclone or flood damage. These works do improve resilience, lowering freight costs and linking industries to ports. But maintenance costs are disproportionately high because traffic volumes are low. Each kilometre of asphalt protects a thin stream of vehicles compared to the packed roads of Sydney or Melbourne. For resource companies, these upgrades are crucial. But for long-term residents, the roads do not create the continuous urban corridors seen in the south. Ports have been another centerpiece. Darwin's port has attracted repeated rounds of expansion, bolstered by both NAIF and private financing. Facilities were built to handle larger container ships and to ensure military vessels could be serviced alongside bulk carriers moving oil or gas. On the east coast, Townsville's port secured funding to expand its role exporting resources from northern Queensland. These developments highlight how infrastructure is designed around export flows. Ports here channel or cattle and gas to Asia. By contrast, Sydney and Melbourne's ports move not just industrial exports but daily imports: groceries, electronics, building materials. In the absence of millions of local consumers, northern ports remain specialized industrial gateways, never pressured to expand into engines of metropolitan trade. Water and irrigation projects have long embodied the dream of population growth in the north. The Ord River scheme is the historic archetype, diverting wet season surges into canals feeding crops on once dry land. In recent years, NAIF has supported extensions and experiments in Queensland's Gulf, aiming to harness floodwaters for year-round cropping. Technical results have been encouraging, with cotton, chia, and horticultural exports proving possible. But the surrounding populations have not multiplied. Chemical inputs, maintenance costs, and the limited scale of improved soils mean these projects support small service towns rather than new cities. For every acre of irrigated farmland, thousands more remain poor in nutrients, reminding planners that water control cannot fully re-engineer tropical landscapes. Energy projects show similar asymmetry. Proposals for colossal solar farms in the Barkly region envision exporting clean power through undersea cables to Asia. NAIF played a role in financing feasibility work and backing transmission capacity. These initiatives could make the North a global supplier of renewable energy. Yet their staffing requirements remain minimal. High-voltage lines, maintenance crews, and specialized engineers number in the hundreds, not tens of thousands. Towns near these plants may gain modest economic activity, but the labor intensity is too low to trigger broad-based settlement. As with ports and irrigation, the effect is to move value outward while leaving limited foundations for community growth. A striking example sits at Darwin's Harbour, the ship lift project, designed to service naval and commercial fleets. With a 26-meter by 103-meter platform capable of lifting 5,500 tons, it reflects cutting-edge engineering funded by $215 million from the Northern Territory government and up to $300 million as a NAIF loan. The project received approval under the federal EPBC Act, subject to environmental conditions. It underscores how serious investment is flowing into the North, but once more it is investment tailored to strategic industry, not population expansion. Telecommunications have filled gaps that once cut remote communities off from the outside world. Fiber links and upgraded satellite connections now reach towns and stations that were, within recent memory, entirely offline. For residents, this provides essential services: distance schooling, telehealth, and business communication. But the population impact is limited. Stable internet alone does not persuade hundreds of thousands to relocate into cyclone zones or climates of alternating flood and drought. It makes life easier for those already there, but does not repopulate the map. Across all these examples, a consistent tension becomes clear. The infrastructure delivered to date reduces isolation and strengthens industries, but at a very high per-person cost. A new bridge in Cairns costs nearly as much to design and build as one in Brisbane, yet serves a fraction of the traffic. A solar farm spread over thousands of hectares can employ fewer ongoing staff than a suburban shopping centre in Sydney. These projects are vital for their industries, yet they do not create the diverse systems of housing, healthcare, education, and services that define actual city life. The contrast with southern Australia is sharp. When Sydney expanded, each new rail line threaded through suburbs already filled with tens of thousands. Hospitals, airports, and universities grew as much from demographic demand as from public policy. In the north, expensive infrastructure often precedes residents, hoping to encourage them to follow. The result is capacity that serves ports, farms, and defense bases without transforming into dense urban neighborhoods. NAIF's investments show this clearly. The focus remains on economic infrastructure, not the social frameworks that make people settle permanently. Momentum, therefore, remains modest. By 2025, highways are smoother, ports larger, and communications stronger. The achievements are real. Still, on a population map, the story has hardly shifted. Darwin continues as a service city, Cairns and Townsville hold steady as regional hubs, and the rest of the north is dotted with widely spaced towns. Infrastructure has widened opportunity for industry, but it has not overcome the fundamental limits that shape human settlement in the tropics. Roads and ports carry minerals and energy outward, But communities continue to grow modestly, without turning the region into a second Sydney or Melbourne. The effect is that Northern Australia looks better supplied from an industrial perspective than at any point in its history, yet the transformation politicians once imagined has not occurred. What has been built sustains extraction and defense, but does not anchor millions of new residents. And while governments plan new programs, another force is arriving that makes the gap between ambition and outcome even sharper. Climate change threat. If Northern Australia was already difficult for settlement, a warming climate adds an even heavier constraint. Scientists estimate that the nation's land surface has warmed by about 1.5 degrees Celsius since 1910, with trends showing sharper extremes in the tropical north. Instead of softening the conditions that have limited cities, climate change makes each obstacle costlier to overcome. This shift turns what were once background challenges, heat, storms, water scarcity, into central factors shaping whether permanent, large-scale urban life is possible. Two clusters of risk define this new reality. Along the coast, a pairing of sea level rise and storm surge puts infrastructure directly in harm's way. National climate records show sea levels have risen around 22 centimeters since 1900, and even modest additional increases threaten wide areas of the North's low-lying shoreline. Mangrove-fringed flats and shallow gradients mean that one extra foot of water can push saltwater much further inland than in steeper coastal zones. Towns such as Darwin and Cairns already weigh the need for levees, raised housing, and protective seawalls. Ports, airports, and power plants sit close to sea level, so each increment of rise locks in higher costs for defense and maintenance. Stronger cyclones worsen the problem. Projections indicate that while the total number of storms may not increase, the most powerful ones are likely to become more intense. A major cyclone driving water several kilometers inland could overwhelm coastal industries and erase years of investment in a single event. Expanding a city onto this terrain means inheriting these defenses as permanent and ever more expensive obligations. Inland volatility forms the second cluster. Already, the north shifts between deluge and drought more sharply than the temperate south. Climate modeling suggests wet season rainfall will arrive in heavier bursts, causing frequent overflows of rivers and swamping floodplains. Roads will cut more often, farmland will saturate, and urban systems such as drains and rail lines will require constant reinforcement. Then the pendulum swings toward longer, hotter dry spells. When aquifers rely on erratic recharge from monsoon storms, prolonged breaks between downpours threaten the security of water supplies. Irrigation projects like the Ord River or New Gulf Queensland schemes depend on enormous floods filling dams, but gaps between events can leave volumes low just as demand peaks. Industries and farms can trim or expand their workforces according to the season, but a permanent city cannot move its people out of harm's way during a new drought. Each step of inland volatility converts into mounting costs: insurance for residents, higher prices for government services, and reduced willingness by private sector developers to gamble on fragile foundations. Heat amplifies all of this. Average maximums are climbing steadily, and humid heat already limits outdoor labor during long stretches of the year. Cities with dense urban heat islands struggle most. Concrete and asphalt trap warmth, pushing temperatures higher overnight. If Darwin, for example, were the size of Melbourne, the electricity needed for cooling would strain grids far beyond today's levels. Health consequences are equally pressing, with older people and outdoor workers at clear risk. For families considering relocation, these constant energy and health burdens add another point against choosing the north when more comfortable climates remain available further south. Fire risk, although less publicized in the north than in the south, also grows as the dry season lengthens. Large areas of savanna dry out more deeply, and wildfires ignite in greater frequency. Fire services already dedicate resources to control burns and mitigation, but with expanding dry spells, the workload increases. A major city surrounded by this environment would face the combined challenge of managing flood, cyclone, and fire exposures at once. Each layer multiplies the maintenance needed for safety, and taken together, they raise the threshold for viability. The economic implications follow directly. The National Climate Resilience Strategy frames disaster costs and insurance premiums as national economic risks. For the North, these pressures mean investors hesitate to anchor large-scale, off-grid urban projects. Ports or mines may justify storm-hardened assets because their output offsets the cost. But a civilian city has no comparable revenue stream. Rising insurance premiums already show the difficulty. Every new subdivision in cyclone-exposed zones or floodplains must absorb higher ongoing charges. Developers naturally retreat if capital outlay and annual overheads cannot compete with more stable options elsewhere in the country. For industries already spread across the tropics, adaptation is possible but uneven. Gas terminals can build higher sea walls. Mining ventures can reinforce haul roads and cyclone-proof dormitories. Cattle stations can rotate stock or irrigate in places with dammed water. Tourism operators target shorter, safer seasons. Crucially, each of these adaptations relies on small or transient workforces. They can stop, restart, or close operations as needed. Permanent residents in a large city cannot do the same. Homes, schools, and hospitals must withstand every cycle. Infrastructure serving millions cannot be mothballed each wet season and restarted each dry. The lack of flexibility adds risk to every long-term investment calculation. Demographics reflect this restraint. Darwin, Cairns, and Townsville still grow, but only in modest increments. They remain mid-sized regional centers rather than breakout capitals. Population statistics are inseparable from climate risk. Households are simply less willing to commit their futures to areas where storms, floods, and fires dominate the horizon. Migration momentum continues instead toward Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, capitals with diverse economies and less punishing hazard profiles. Taken together, climate change acts not as a new opportunity, but as a constraint multiplier. The North's traditional challenges, poor soils, volatile rainfall, cyclones, already limited city building, warming, rising seas, and intensifying extremes extend those limits further. What was once difficult now verges on prohibitive. Rather than laying the groundwork for a northern metropolis, climate projections suggest the opposite: higher costs, narrower tolerances, and greater fragility. This does not strip the North of significance. It remains vital for resources, tourism, indigenous culture, and national identity. But as a stage for mass population growth, the climate story makes clear why settlement will remain sparse. The central issue is no longer whether the North should host millions, but how its value can be realized under conditions that rule out conventional metropolitan development. And that line of questioning points toward a very different role for the region in Australia's future: strategic importance in the Indo-Pacific. Northern Australia's present significance stems less from future cities and more from its position inside the evolving Indo-Pacific security landscape. While settlement has stalled, its geography gives Australia and its partners a forward base into one of the world's most strategically contested regions. Agriculture and resource markets rise and fall with global demand, yet the security weight of the North has only increased as competition between major powers intensifies. Darwin, in particular, has become emblematic of this shift. Though home to fewer than 150,000 people, it now anchors facilities and partnerships that link Australia closely to its allies and underline its regional role. The most visible element has been the rotational presence of United States Marines. Beginning in 2012 with small contingents, the program has grown into a standing cycle where thousands of troops rotate through Darwin for half-year deployments. These rotations support joint training with Australian forces, improve readiness in tropical conditions, and ensure a capacity for rapid response to crises in Southeast Asia or the Pacific. Importantly, this is not a permanent American base. The arrangement avoids continuous family relocation or permanent housing construction, but it still makes Darwin a hub in the US-Australia alliance. For a relatively small city, hosting this cycle elevates its role far above its population size. Alongside this, wider defense spending has reshaped the North. Australia has directed billions into modernizing its forces, and significant portions target northern bases and infrastructure. Tyndall Air Base near Katherine has been upgraded to support longer-range aircraft, including US bombers during exercises. Townsville remains the backbone of Australia's army in the tropics, hosting the 3rd Brigade and supporting regional deployments. Fuel storage tanks, radar coverage, and munitions facilities have been steadily expanded across the top end. Each of these steps ties national defense planning directly to the northern frontier. International engagement adds another layer. Indo-Pacific Endeavour, or IPE, has become Australia's flagship regional program. Conducted annually, it sends naval task groups, aircraft, and personnel across South and Southeast Asia for training exercises, humanitarian workshops, and cooperation on maritime law and disaster relief. By 2025, IPE emphasizes exchange of expertise as much as display of military capability. Northern ports and bases serve as the departure points and logistical hubs for this effort. Their position makes them indispensable to the program, even though civilian populations nearby remain modest. Submarine Rotational Force West is another strategic initiative. Although its main hub is in Western Australia, its relevance extends to the north because it demonstrates how Australia is integrating tightly with US planning in the Indo-Pacific. These deployments underline that security partnerships depend on secure northern infrastructure, whether or not millions of Australians live nearby. In fact, sparse population can be advantageous. Training ranges, airspace allocations, and port facilities face fewer competing civilian demands compared with Sydney or Melbourne, granting military planners flexibility. This separation of military presence from civilian expansion is important. Strategic investment raises the international profile of Darwin and Townsville, but it does not bring large waves of settlers. US Marines rotate out after each cycle. Naval engagements under Indo-Pacific Endeavour return to their home bases. Even large Australian investments generate only a limited number of permanent defence personnel. The focus is readiness and interoperability, not long-term city building. Defence facilities and transient forces require logistics, barracks, and training areas, not suburbs of new households. At the same time, the North has become a political flashpoint in debates over security and sovereignty. The 2015 decision to lease Darwin Port to a company tied to China remains the clearest example. Though defended at the time as a commercial transaction likely to improve infrastructure, the lease generated heated national debate. Critics argued it created potential vulnerability in an era of sharpening US-China rivalry. The saga turned a local economic deal into an emblem of how infrastructure in the North intersects with geopolitics. It stands now as a cautionary example. Every decision about ports or energy projects in Northern Australia resonates far beyond its immediate location. Geography explains why northern installations matter. To the north stretch the Indonesian archipelagos, home to maritime choke points such as the Lombok and Sunda Straits. To the east lies the Coral Sea, gateway to Melanesia and the Pacific Islands. Control and access to these routes are central to US and Chinese strategies in the Indo-Pacific. Northern Australia, with Darwin's harbour in particular, provides a deep water port close to these passageways and fully under Australian control. This makes it a fallback and staging ground for Allied operations, a position that carries outsized influence in regional security planning. What may appear counterintuitive is that the absence of a metropolis strengthens this role. Without millions of residents, military activities encounter fewer obstacles. Vast tracts of land can be used for live-fire ranges. Air corridors can be reserved for exercises without constant disruption to civilian flights. Ports can be expanded without the logistical clashes seen in crowded commercial hubs. For defense planning, this makes the North unusually adaptable. The same demographic limits that frustrate economic development grant flexibility to military operators. From Canberra's perspective, the modernization of defense posture now explicitly recognizes this logic. Strategy documents emphasize the shift from focusing on distant missions in the Middle East to securing the Indo-Pacific theater. Northern Australia is central to this transition. It houses the assets that connect Australia to Allied networks, offers storage and dispersal points, and provides terrain for exercises matched to tropical conditions. Even if its cities remain small, its reach extends deeply into the regional balance of power. The implications for local communities are tangible but bounded. Defense contracts, construction, and maintenance inject spending into Darwin, Townsville, and smaller towns. Hospitality and retail receive periodic boosts during joint training seasons. But unlike resource booms that bring temporary workforce surges, defense activities are carefully calibrated. Personnel numbers remain steady, rotational by design, and not intended to seed suburb after suburb. For everyday residents, this stability provides security and a modest trickle of economic benefit. For strategists, it offers continuity without the complications of urban congestion. This duality, low population but high strategic weight, defines the North's present position. Defense planners see it as Australia's forward operating zone, yet the physical and demographic conditions ensure it does not resemble Singapore, Manila, or Jakarta. Its importance stems not from millions of consumers or factories, but from its ability to provide secure, open space for Allied operations. Security, not settlement, is the lens through which it matters most. That realization clarifies why metropolitan comparisons often mislead. Northern Australia's trajectory has diverged from other tropical regions because its value lies in defense and logistics rather than city building. The contrast with global hubs elsewhere illustrates how geography, history, and national strategy pull in different directions. And while some tropical locations have grown into engines of dense urban life, the north of Australia has anchored itself firmly in a different role. This difference is the key to understanding why nearby examples may not offer a template to follow. Global comparisons. Why not another Singapore? When people ask why Northern Australia lacks a city like Singapore or Miami, the assumption is often that tropical conditions alone explain the difference. But the real divide is structural, not climatic. Other tropical hubs have grown precisely because geography and policy made density unavoidable, while Australia has consistently had other, easier options. The parallels only sharpen once the details are examined more closely. Take Singapore as the clearest comparison. Its position astride the Strait of Malacca placed it directly on one of the tightest shipping funnels in global trade. For centuries, ships had no alternative but to pass nearby, whether moving between Europe, India, and China or linking through the South China Sea. That geographic compulsion created a captive flow of maritime traffic, and the city's leaders invested heavily to capture its value, first as a refueling point, later as a transshipment port, and eventually as a financial and technology hub. Government policy reinforced these foundations. Immigration was deliberately encouraged, density was embraced as a necessity, and state-directed housing policies concentrated millions efficiently into high-rise neighborhoods. Trade necessity and deliberate migration policy worked in tandem to build a city-state that now functions as one of the world's most connected economies. Darwin, by contrast, sits close to Asia but not on a trade choke point. Ships heading from Northeast Asia to India, the Middle East, or Europe naturally move through the Malacca, Sunda, or Lombok Straits. They do not need to detour down to Australia's northern coast. That absence of geographic necessity makes the difference. Darwin has a viable port, but what passes through is mainly bulk resources, or gas, cattle, not the dense containerized commerce that sustains metropolitan-scale hubs. Proximity alone is not enough when trade routes prefer straighter, more direct paths. For perspective, Australia's total two-way trade with ASEAN reached nearly $193 billion in 2023-24. These connections are critical, but they flow through Singapore, Jakarta, or Kuala Lumpur instead of anchoring themselves in the top end. Miami provides a different lesson. It is exposed to hurricanes, humid summers, and the risk of flooding, yet it grew into a leading city because of its place inside a continental system of demand. Miami is locked into a domestic market of more than 300 million people, surrounded by highways, cargo rail, and passenger air links that bind Florida to the rest of the United States. Its environment may be challenging, but the surrounding scale of population and purchasing power justified decades of investment in tourism, trade, and financial services. Miami also acted as a gateway into the U.S. for migrants from Latin America and the Caribbean, creating steady inflows of workforce and cultural networks. This combination, continental integration and migration density, was far more decisive for Miami's rise than its actual climate. Darwin lacks this continental pull. Its nearest major Australian neighbours are thousands of kilometres away, and the bulk of the nation's consumers live in temperate zones around Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. Infrastructure grids, energy, rail, media, universities are designed around those cities, drawing migration southwards regardless of the North's proximity to Asia. Policy has doubled down on this pattern. Rather than funneling arrivals into the north, national migration systems concentrate most newcomers in the largest hubs where established communities and economic opportunities are already in place. As a result, Darwin receives only a small portion of growth and finds itself on the periphery of its own country's demographic center of gravity. The difference is not just about where migrants go, it is about how cities respond once people arrive. Singapore accepted that survival required extreme density. Public housing estates reached high into the sky. Water recycling and desalination plants compensated for limited freshwater, and food imports were secured as a permanent national strategy. Miami allowed suburban sprawl but still absorbed huge migrant inflows, reinforcing service industries, real estate, and financial links. Both cities turned difficult climates into trade-offs they had little choice but to accept. By contrast, Australia never faced that necessity. The country possessed vast temperate lowlands where cities could comfortably spread outward. Policies evolved around detached houses, quarter-acre blocks, and car-based suburbs. Instead of finding ways to compress millions into Darwin, governments and households continually channeled growth into the south, where land and climate made expansion far easier. It can be stated in three straightforward contrasts. Singapore grew at a choke point where global trade had to pass. Darwin sits off-route. Singapore and Miami attracted constant migration streams that fed density. Australia directed migration south into suburbs rather than north into compact cities. And finally, Singapore and Miami plugged directly into high-value global commerce, finance, logistics, technology, tourism, while Northern Australia remained tied to extractive industries and seasonal visitors. These contrasts reveal why geography and governance outweigh climate when explaining urban outcomes. Tropical conditions in themselves do not prohibit a megacity. Millions thrive in such environments elsewhere. But without the geographic compulsion of a choke point, without national migration policy channeling arrivals, and without integration into high-value global networks, a city cannot scale up to the tens of millions. Northern Australia possesses resources and strategic weight, but these are not the same ingredients that make an urban giant. For Darwin, Cairns, and Townsville, these limits translate into staying mid-sized regional centers rather than global metropolises. They perform important functions as tourist gateways, military hubs, or service towns. Yet the engines that fuel places like Singapore and Miami are absent. Proximity to Asia is real, but trade routes bypass them. The demographic concentration that feeds metropolitan growth is absent because migration is directed elsewhere, and the kinds of industries that require deep pools of professional labor are clustered in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane rather than in the north. It is tempting to imagine that strong political will, hefty infrastructure funding, or clever urban design could reverse this equation. But the broader national picture shows why that has not happened. Australia's systems of finance, energy, education, and governance are built around its southern arc public institutions, corporate headquarters, national markets, and cultural influence all reinforce those locations. When trade or resource projects appear in the north, they are linked back into southern capitals rather than forming the spine of new metropolises. In economic geography, this is known as path dependence, the tendency of early development choices to lock in future outcomes. So while comparisons to Singapore or Miami highlight what the North lacks, the more useful insight lies in why Southern Australia continues to dominate. When a nation builds its infrastructure and institutions densely around one corridor, momentum pulls ever more people and investment into the same orbit. That is why Darwin remains small despite its strategic position, and why Cairns and Townsville serve as important but secondary centers. The balance is not a temporary oversight but a structural outcome of history, policy, and geography that directed growth southward and kept it there. This context makes the next question unavoidable. If southern concentration is so entrenched, could Australia realistically shift its population balance after more than 2 centuries of building almost everything around the south and east? The weight of inertia. On maps, the north looks like open possibility. Vast coastline, proximity to Asia, large tracts of unused land. Yet the idea that it could quickly transform into a new population center underestimates what decades and centuries of accumulated choices mean in practice. This is the essence of inertia. In simple terms, inertia, or path dependence, means that once societies take a direction, every investment and habit compounds, making later alternatives harder to adopt. In Australia's case, early choices about where to farm and where to dock ships locked the country into a southern orientation. Over time, those choices built entire systems, markets, universities, and institutions that reinforced themselves through constant inflows of people. From the beginning, the southeast held the features early colonists needed. Fertile soils allowed crops to take root, rivers provided transport, and temperate conditions eased survival. Sydney and Melbourne grew out of those conditions into anchor cities. Once they passed thresholds of size, advantages began to multiply on their own. Factories clustered where workers were already located. Roads and rail stitched those cities closer together, lowering costs and setting conditions for further growth. Migration streams fed these centers because jobs, schools, and services expanded there first. As the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has noted in summaries of Australia's settlement history, early agricultural and port investments in the southeast gave rise to institutions that continue to draw migration generations later. That process has compounded to the present day. Sydney and Melbourne not only dominate population charts, but also host the country's financial markets, business headquarters, major hospitals, and world-ranked universities. Canberra, positioned deliberately between them, sits at the heart of government decision-making. These concentrations attract further attention and opportunity. Skilled workers, professional networks, and capital all flow to where infrastructure already exists. Darwin and Cairns may sit closer to Asia on the map, but they lack this depth of institutions. A single policy push cannot instantaneously replicate 2 centuries of investment in the South. Infrastructure illustrates the imbalance clearly. Commuter rail systems in Sydney and Melbourne move millions of people every day. Each line is sustained by decades of population growth and fuels further concentration. Research ecosystems grow around universities such as the University of Melbourne or the University of Sydney, spawning clusters of innovation and attracting global companies. Healthcare systems in those capitals support large populations, allowing advanced hospitals to accumulate expertise and equipment. These are not facilities that can be copied overnight elsewhere. To shift millions of Australians northward would demand decades of new universities, hospitals, supply chains, and labour markets. Essentially a reversal of centuries of momentum. Trade works in the same direction. The north may be geographically closer to Asia, but consumer demand lies overwhelmingly in the southern capitals. Shipping companies direct their cargo to Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane because that is where tens of millions of buyers are located. Darwin's port specializes in bulk export commodities, cattle or gas, rather than the dense traffic of containers that defines modern metropolitan economies. Once again, the alignment of markets, households, and logistics makes southern orientation the efficient option. Migration patterns follow. New arrivals tend to settle where existing communities, services, and jobs already are. Skilled visa programs and international student placements funnel people into universities and industries that are concentrated in the south. That further perpetuates the feedback loop. Cities with established populations become ever more attractive because they offer opportunity at scale, while the north remains a secondary option with thinner social and economic networks. Urban economics gives this loop a name: agglomeration effects. When industries, workers, and services cluster together, their combined presence creates productivity advantages that no individual city can easily imitate from scratch. Sydney can add the equivalent of Darwin's entire population in the space of a few years. Each decade, this growth locks in even more services, which then draw in additional migrants. Once agglomeration builds momentum, it is self-reinforcing. Breaking such a cycle comes with enormous difficulty. Businesses would not suddenly abandon supply chains, clients, and urban networks to start anew in the north without compelling reasons. Workers would not forego established career ladders, healthcare systems, and school networks without strong incentives. Even should governments push migration northward, the long-term uncertainty, whether tropical soil, water, and climate can offer security comparable to temperate south, remains. Risk cuts against momentum whenever families calculate where to anchor their lives. Scholars describe this constraint as path dependency. The cost of reversing course grows so large that past decisions shape the future more than present preferences. Australia's path was set when fertile ground and port access concentrated settlement in the south. Colonies survived and thrived there, while northern experiments failed. Each generation since has added more infrastructure and institutions to the same regions. Cities are not interchangeable pieces to be relocated. They are webs of networks rooted in history, geography, and demography. Politics deepens this inertia. Federal politics and budget priorities often reflect population distribution, and because more voters live in southern states, infrastructure dollars also flow there. Representatives from New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland's southeast carry weight in shaping national spending. Major transport projects, hospitals, and research programs skew south because that is where they serve the most people and garner the most votes. Northern priorities occasionally gain attention, but electoral arithmetic ensures the South anchors resource allocation in most cases. This does not mean investment in the North is absent. The Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility, major defence upgrades, and agricultural programs in Queensland and the Northern Territory demonstrate recognition of the region's role. Yet these projects have tended to reinforce extractive and strategic functions more than drive mass settlement. They serve mines, ports, and bases rather than building city systems that would naturally hold millions. Urban growth depends on schools, hospitals, service industries, and professional employment, all items that only develop through long-term compounding, not through single projects. Inertia, then, is not just an abstract concept but a practical barrier. To realistically alter Australia's population geography would require an immense and sustained effort. Constructing entire education systems, replicating world-class healthcare, extending rail corridors over vast distances, and sustaining this build-up for decades. It would involve redrawing economic linkages and convincing families to endure harsher climate conditions despite smoother options elsewhere. The scale of commitment would dwarf historic schemes like the Snowy Mountains Hydro Project or interstate rail building, and even then, success would remain uncertain. What this tells us is that the absence of a northern metropolis is neither anomaly nor oversight. It is the product of built-in structures that pull people south and keep them there. Agriculture, trade, migration, finance, and politics all point in the same direction. A cumulative path that resists change. Northern towns continue to function as regional centres, but without the multiplying effects seen in Sydney or Melbourne, their growth stays modest. By 2025, the pattern is unmistakable. The South dominates not because of a single policy, but because 2 centuries of choices hardened into a self-sustaining system. Path dependence explains why even sweeping investment has not redrawn the map. The inertia of history and infrastructure creates a boundary that politics, economics, and demography rarely cross. The implication is that the North's role, while important, rests on different foundations than mass settlement. Understanding this weight of inertia is essential. It shows why climate, soil, and even strategic location alone cannot produce a metropolis if momentum runs in the opposite direction. And it sets the stage for recognizing the North's continuing value on its own terms, not as a mirror of the South's urban pattern, but as something distinctive in Australia's national story. Looking at the broader national picture, certain lessons stand out clearly. First, the North is strategically and economically vital. Its minerals, gas, cattle, and defence facilities feed directly into Australia's future. Second, a major metropolis remains unlikely under current economic, climatic, and political conditions. Natural limits, history, and momentum all favour growth in the South. Third, this does not make the North unimportant. Its role is secured through resources, ecosystems, and defence infrastructure, with NAIF and defence programs continuing to anchor investment as of mid-2025. If this overview surprised you, drop a comment with a northern city you imagine should exist, and subscribe for more geography deep dives.